Hey, Chris Kreiser, how are you, man?
I'm doing good, my friend. Good to see you again, buddy.
Good to see you. This is very appropriate that you are the first guest for the initial episode of Walking Inside Poems for a couple of reasons. One, we chose a very appropriate poem, Billy Collins' poem "Introduction to Poetry," and I say it's appropriate because I took the title from for this podcast directly from that poem. It's also appropriate because you've taught that poem in class before, have you not?
I do. I do. I teach like a gen ed course that is called critical reading, and part of the course is a section on poetry. And
Yeah.
so I do this poem, and the kids dig it.
Yeah. Chris, why don't you, full disclosure to listeners, Chris and I have known each other for many years. We were PhD students together back in the 90s at Texas A&M University. Time flies, brother, whether you're having fun or not. But hey, why don't you give people just a super quick uh, potted biography of who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, after I got my PhD from Texas A&M, that next fall I started teaching at Slippery Rock University in Western PA, and time flies, like you say, my friend. This is my 21st year, 21 years
Wow.
at Slippery Rock, and love it. Great university. And I teach in the English program. And so, like all the English faculty, I do a lot of what are just kind of called, the gen ed courses. We call them rock studies courses.
Yeah.
And part of that is like a critical reading course, interpreting lit type course. And so we do, well, I think inevitably, I'm not going to talk shop, but inevitably, some of my course experiences with this poem will more
Yeah.
than likely come out in our discussion. So,
Absolutely will. Yeah, I know. Again, that's why it's so appropriate. Well, look, let's just jump into it. Let me say a few words about Billy Collins, and then maybe you can, if you want to add anything to that. He was the Poet Laureate of the United States from 2001 to 2003. He was the New York State Poet from 2004 to 2006. Grew up in New York City. I just found this out. I didn't know it. His mom was a nurse, though she stopped working to raise him, I believe. His dad worked on Wall Street, and Collins has taught for many years at several universities, but he's decidedly not a very academic guy, as anyone who's delved into his poetry would know. He's an extremely popular poet. The New York Times called him the most popular U.S. poet, and I'm pretty sure his books sell more than any other poet, at least any other poet alive. Lots of awards, probably about 20 published books. The book that the poem we're going to work with, talk about, comes from a book called The Apple That Astonished Paris. I think it's his third book, but Collins called it his first real book of poems. Anything you want to say about Billy Collins other than that, Chris?
I love the line, he's a very popular poet. I think that's akin to saying he's a very popular jazz musician. he's sold
Indeed.
over, he's sold in the hundreds.
Yeah,
Um,
but he is kind of unique in that sense. He's had
yes,
quite a career. He was voted one or named one of the 100 favorite TED Talk speakers. I mean, he's just a guy that is not the typical poet in a lot of ways.
right.
And one of the things we love about him is his comedy, man. He's hilarious.
Woo. I was going to say I had the luck, the blessing to see him speak at the Chautauqua Institute with Paul Simon. And I think everyone knows Paul Simon is kind of this really dry, funny, humorous fella.
Yeah,
Billy Collins and Paul Simon together, it was like Steve Martin and Martin Short up there.
that's great.
They were beautifully funny, charming, charismatic. One of the more enjoyable lectures I've seen in the
Yeah,
past, I'll say 5 years or so. Yeah, it was great. Very
that
charming man.
that's fantastic. For my other podcast, I just talked to a poet yesterday by the name of Karen McCadden, and one of the things she talked about was the similarities between comedy and poetry. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that element of surprise is very important in both. Well, look, let me read the poem, and then let's just talk about it. So it is called Introduction to Poetry. and it's clearly situated with a teacher in a classroom with students.
Yeah.
I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Okay, so how do you teach this poem? It's kind of ironic that you're teaching students who he's probably talking about, in effect.
1000%. I can feel, I don't want to say the frustration, but I have mixed, you know what, I'm just going to say it, John, I have mixed feelings about this poem. English major, I love it. And I love the imagery, and I love the metaphors, and I love the various reading methodologies that he offers. And that's how I teach it. And I guess I'll say more about that in a minute. But also, I just, as a teacher, if I put on my pedagogy hat, I wouldn't have the balls to say to my students, I want you to water ski across this text and write a paper about that.
Oh, yeah.
And so I love those imageries, and my students do respond well to it because the imageries, the metaphors are not that complicated. So right. I think non-English majors, non-poetry people can grab hold of it. Mm-hmm. So it is a fun poem to teach, but there is that certain element of, maybe we got to teach poetry a bit better. I think he's writing it from a place of a little bit of that just frustration.
Yeah, and he's
talk about the poem,
and he's having fun with it for sure. I do think he probably would say, I don't want to speak for him, but he'd say, it's unfortunate that we have to have our students write papers about poetry, because then how do you avoid explicating the poem in ways that he's probably criticizing here? How do you avoid tying it to a chair and whipping out the meaning, So, but there's other things to say about it. Let's jump in there, Chris. What do you think about the this first idea of holding it to the light like a color slide? Anything resonate there with you?
I love that the first metaphorical methodology is a scientific one. Let's put this poem as if it were in a laboratory and hold it up. Maybe when I think of a color slide, you might be referencing, like Kodachrome. Is that those old slides you would put on the carousel?
Oh yeah.
But just when he holds it up to the light like a color slide, I feel a bit, kind of like a scientific slide.
Interesting.
And I do like that one. That first image for, again, students who he doesn't want to, students that he wants to stretch out a little bit and not beat it with a rope to find a distinct literal meaning. Mm-hmm. And this first is very inviting. It's a very inviting metaphor, and I think it's the least humanities based.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even think about it that way. That's interesting. I like that. I went straight to the visual arts.
Yeah, okay.
I've said for a long time, why is it that people, and of course I'm a songwriter, and so there's so many similarities between poetry and songwriting. Sometimes people say, what kind of music you play? And I say, I really write poems and then put them to music. But my point is, people ask, what does it mean? And they want to go straight in, I'm jumping to the end, but they want to go straight to the meaning, like it's prose or like it's an essay or something. And I've said for a long time, why don't people say that with paintings? People don't go to this Remington painting of this cowboy on the horse and say, what does it mean? They don't think about that. They just experience the visual art. And so I think one of the things Collins is doing there is saying, hey, don't worry about it. Just experience it visually. Now, one of the interesting things that we'll get into is that starts off with visual, so you're seeing it, and then the next image we'll get into it's the ear. We're hearing it, and then we're feeling it, and for that light switch, so those very
tactile.
Yeah, yeah. So.
And John, I'm going to interrupt, or I'm going to piggyback on.
Please.
I'm going to go straight academic. I'm going to steal your good idea and make it my own. I hadn't really thought about that visual idea. I think that's beautiful. And that stanza, 3 lines, is followed up by a quick 1-line stanza, which is, stanzas are such a beautiful visual of poetry that prose doesn't have. Yeah, I have the poem right here in front of me myself.
Yeah. Not a whole lot to talk about structure wise. It is free verse. It's 7 stanzas of varying length, but yeah, that is interesting. Now, why do we want to talk about why? So when he goes to the visual, from the visual to the auditory, we gotta deal with this hive, because that's one of the most interesting things in the poem. Press an ear against its hive. It's just a 1-line stanza, the only 1-line stanza in the poem, which kind of makes it marks it in a way. It really makes it noticeable.
It slows you down and allows that split second for your ear to open up. Like, what would a hive sound like? And I like that a lot, that moment.
Buzzing bees, right?
Yeah. And that's the first image is a kind of a traditional simile, like a color slide. Every kid knows a simile. This one, or press an ear against its hive, is a slightly more complex writing and a slightly more complex image, because it's not even an image, it's auditory. So I beautiful. So many beautiful layers going on here.
There's a danger to it. It's almost like, you better not literally press your ear against a hive.
Good point.
Or you're going to get stung pretty severely. So maybe, I don't know if that's what he has in mind, but maybe he's saying, go out on a limb, be a little dangerous, don't play it safe. But the main thing I get is it's the bees buzzing. Listen to the sound of the buzzes, listen to those sounds. And actually, since you went scientific on the first image, you could go scientific on this one too. Almost like a beekeeper or someone studying bees. And then we get a mouse. Sorry, Chris,
Yeah.
were you going to say something else about the bees?
No, but I'm a bit intrigued by the idea of going out on a limb where the hive would be, and then of course being on a limb with a beehive, the dangers of that, and then versus the professional who can't, I don't know what professional beekeepers do, but you got to think they listen, they can tell the difference between one buzzing and a next. And so there's this expertise or not. Yeah. You don't have to be that guy. You can be the risk taker. Yeah. And so you have a lot of different options for how to look at a poem.
So let me play the devil's advocate at this point. And I'm imagining most people who are watching this podcast are not, they're probably poetry lovers already, but imagine one of your students at this point saying, what in the hell are you guys talking about? Why doesn't he just say what he means? Right. Why doesn't he just, if you have to work and figure out what are the implications, what's the whole point? How do you help students with that kind of probably very typical attitude?
Oh, typical attitude. Great. But it's a legitimate question. And I always come back with 2 tried and true statements that I've used for many, many years now. I was lucky enough to see just a televised interview with Edward Albee. And he was talking about his most recent play. And the interviewer said, Mr. Albee, can you tell me what this play is about? And Edward Albee says, it's about 2.5 hours long.
Yeah.
And the interviewer laughed and she goes, oh, that's clever. But really, maybe in a sentence or two, can you tell me what it's about? And he goes, if I could tell you what the play was about in a sentence or two, the play would be a sentence or two long.
Yeah.
It is about everything that is encompassed in these words in this text.
Yeah.
Poetry is the same way. And then I say, biology is the same way. The sciences are the same way. Just because you walk through this classroom door does not mean language changes. Language is not all of a sudden complex in an English class and then straightforward and literal in another class. And then I say, for example, take the easiest text imaginable. Your partner just texted you the letter K. Literally, they're saying everything is A-OK. But if you've ever gotten a K after sending a long text of explanation of where you were last night, nothing, my friend, is A-OK. Yeah. And so just a single letter requires.
What did he mean? What did he mean by that?
What do they mean? What do they mean? What do they mean? And language doesn't operate that way. Poetry runs with that. Yeah. But, biology, those texts are tough to read and require interpretation and meaning-making process. And so, language doesn't change when you go into an English classroom.
Yeah, I don't know if students. It's a different way of using language, certainly, but it definitely has that. I mean, we're still dealing with the tools of communication. We're still dealing with the building blocks, which are words. And yeah. So how about the mouse? Now in the next stanza, we start with a 3-line stanza, then a 1-line stanza, and then I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. What do you think about the mouse? Anything?
That's my favorite because it's the first image that is not you. It's not the kid. So it kind of takes the pressure off the student, and the student can say, okay, wait, you gave this hypothetical student of like, what the heck is going on here? Why don't they just say what they mean? And this stanza allows them to be reminded that let's pause and let's see what other kids are saying. Let's see how other people probe their way through this poem. And maybe I can learn from my classmates or fellow readers of this poem. So I like that one.
Yeah, me too.
What about you?
I like it too. And I have the image in my mind of people standing around looking down at a maze and watching the mouse running around inside that maze trying to find his way out. But it's mainly, to me, it's curiosity, it's fun, it's the surprise of dropping a mouse into the poem. It's got that Billy Collins irreverence too. Let's not take it too seriously. Drop a mouse. If you're getting too serious about it, drop a mouse in there.
I like that route. The irreverence. I still, perhaps because I'm teaching so many science majors, I see it as another laboratory experiment. Let's drop a mouse in and gauge, how long it takes the mouse to find it and where they go, and kind of this observational scientific method of learning how to get into the mind of a mouse or how to interpret a poem.
Yeah. Yeah, and it has a little bit of I like that. It has a little bit of again, let's not jump straight to meaning. Let's experience it. Let's watch. Yeah. And there's maybe some implicit things to learn here by watching that mouse. It's not going to be very explicit. It's tacit learning of some sort, just watching this mouse.
It's observational. There's not one way to do it. Let's see how all our fellow mice do it, I guess, fellow people.
So we have visual, and then we have auditory, and then we're participating a little bit more by dropping the mouse in, but we're still watching. And then we have the 4th stanza, walk inside the poem's room, which I just adore. Walk inside and feel the walls for a light switch. I'm thinking there we're exploring, where it's tactile again, but at this time it's touch, and we're feeling the walls. We're sort of in the dark, aren't we? We're in the dark, but we're feeling our way, trying to find the light.
That's my least favorite.
Really? Is it too obvious, or what? Why is it your least favorite?
I don't like the binary on-off light switch.
Ah,
That all we need to do is flip a light and everything will be revealed. I think that's a bit of a, I don't know if, I love the phrase inside the poem's room.
yeah.
And you could certainly say that within the poem's room, it's a space constructed, it's a reality based on this poem. And so the light switch will reveal its reality, which is going to be different from the next room and next room. But an idea of a light switch shining light on a poem, I think kind of falls back to the idea of here's what the poem means. We just have to have the light switch on. And I love, multiplicity of meaning is better than just on off.
Yeah.
For me, at
And I hear you, and I understand that reaction to it. It's, yeah, I get that. Maybe I didn't have that reaction. I didn't think of it as so binary. I didn't think it was implicit that he was saying as soon as you flip the switch, it all becomes apparent.
Right. Yeah.
What you have in mind here, maybe a better image for him. Let's tell Billy Collins. Let's tell him what he should have done. Is a flashlight, because it's not all revealed, and you're still kind of looking around. It's not all, but yeah, interesting. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah. Now, I wonder if your students are troubled by surface there, saying, "Oh, you don't want me to dig into anything deep into the meaning. We're just supposed to stay at the surface level."
I had not exactly caught that implication.
Okay.
I just think of the joy of water skiing and how fun that is. And I absolutely love waving at the author's name on the shore.
Yeah.
Yo, dude, look at me. I'm killing it. My
Yeah.
poem, my lake, my pond, my boat, my water skis. I'm having fun. Thank you, but I got it from here.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
I love this one.
and it's all, again, to me, and I just think maybe it's my preconceived notions about Billy because he is so irreverent sometimes, but I think of an irreverence there of, the author doesn't matter that much. We're gonna wave, hey, but I'm the one doing the skiing on this poem, not you. I'll wave to you. I'll acknowledge you. I'll wave to you on the shore.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Yeah. I love that one. And I love that he doesn't even say waving at the author, but the author's name.
Yeah.
Furthering just the idea that the author's name, we don't know Billy Collins. He's a construct.
Yeah.
He's a poet to us. He's a husband or partner,
Yeah.
dad, grandpa to someone else, neighbor.
Yeah. So we'll acknowledge him, and we'll wave to him, but we're not going to worry too much about him. And then from that point, it gets pretty obvious what we're talking about. All they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it.
Yeah.
That interrogation that they think we want them to do, or that people tend to want to do, and they begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah. Yeah, there is, even though there's a humor to Collins, like you said when we started off, there's a frustration in him. There's a kind of almost a little feeling of you idiots. You idiot, you just want to beat the shit out of this poem with a hose. What's wrong with you? Can't you just enjoy the poem?
And that's a strange, I'm a rhetoric professor. I'm not a lit guy. Never have been a lit guy, never wanted to be a lit guy. And one hang up I always have, and I feel it with this poem, is why don't you get poetry? Why don't you get poetry?
Mm-hmm.
And then, why don't I get tax codes? Why don't I understand, 401ks? And I don't. That's not my literacy. That's not my thing.
Yeah.
And I love it when a student's eyes light up and they enjoy something in my class, whatever, poetry, rhetoric, a novel, writing.
Mhm.
But I'm always leery of like, this is beautiful. Why don't you dig it?
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, I don't know.
And
Some
maybe
people
he's
like to be,
not, maybe he's not taking it quite that far. Maybe we're assuming something there, but
I think we are. And I keep coming back to just the frustration. You know, like I think every
yeah.
teacher in every content area is like, end of the day, some days like, oh my God, how do my kids not know the multiplication tables? They're
Uh-huh.
so easy, but they
Uh-huh.
don't. So
Yeah.
you go back the next day and teach it again.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the Billy Collins that I want to envision. End of the day, he's frustrated. Next day, hey, y'all, let's go water skiing,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
so, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed the poem. I love so much of Billy Collins' work. I've got a shelf full of his books over there. I grabbed three of them just to show people if I was going to recommend anything else. Nine Horses is one of my favorites of his. I won't read it, but I think probably my favorite Billy Collins poem is in this book. It's called Aimless Love. Do you know that one?
You know what? I don't. I just right now, I'm going to read more Billy Collins on your recommendation.
Well, Aimless Love, I said I'm not going to read it and I won't, but it's so good. It has this sort of ironic sense of, on one hand, the falling in love with the everyday ordinary things, out on a walk and falling in love with a tree and a bird, and just have that strong sense of connection to, that's, as our old professor John McDermott used to say, the intensity of felt relations with the things around you. But
Beautiful.
then there's a little tweak in the poem that basically he's saying that kind of love is much safer than romantic love, where you can get hurt. You can get hurt. And
Oh,
there's
I love it.
one line I will read to you here. He says, this is the kind of best love, I thought, without recompense, without gifts or unkind words, without suspicion or silence on the telephone, no slam of the door. So
Oh,
it's a nice little delicious irony there.
beautiful.
Also, like this one, The Trouble with Poetry. That's a good poem that has some similarities to the one we read. And then Sailing Around the Room is another one of my favorites. I don't know if that's showing up, but it's called Sailing Around the Room, new and selected poems. Yeah, read Billy Collins. He's great. Chris, I want you to read the poem for us to kind of take us out. But before you do that, is there anything else you would like to say about Billy Collins or about poetry or about anything else?
One thing, because again, I'm always weary of being the teacher that teaches his favorite things and expects everyone to see how cool they are,
Hmm.
you know? And so picking poems is always tricky for me because, I mean, talk about being moved. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Every time I read that, I'm like, wow, this is greatness in action. And me and, 10 other people think would want to read that poem, and my students never would. So picking poetry is hard. And I love this poem. The kids really respond to it. And what greater thing perhaps could be said about a poet than that they awaken in others this love of language. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And one time someone described poetry, and I don't know who said this, and it might even be a famous quote, but they said the power of poetry is to remind us of the power of language. I can take the word bread, which we see and eat every day, and through a poem, remind you of our daily bread and the life affirming gift that breaking bread with your family is. And it's like, wow, amen. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And every time, yeah, when I read a poem, it just like gives you that feeling that the world is a beautiful place and a special place and a lot of feelings and beautiful.
Love
So I
that.
love poetry.
I think it was Mary Oliver. Maybe it wasn't her, but I love her poetry, by the way. And I know we'll get some of her poems on this podcast, but I think it was her. I hope it was. She said, if you want to bake a cake, you pull out a recipe. Now, if you want to bake the cake that your grandmother used to make, you pull out the recipe. If you want to talk about what that cake means to you, you can pull out poetry.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Well, Chris, thank you for doing this. Will you take us out by reading the poem? I'd love to hear it in your voice.
I'd love to. I'd love to. All right. Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room, feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it, to begin beating it with a hose, to find out what it really means. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much. Thank you for being my first guest on this podcast. We'll see what happens with it. The intention here is just to get more poetry into people's lives, into my own life, to celebrate poetry. And thank you so much for launching it with me. And
Beautiful.
I'm always happy to talk to you, and I will talk to you down the road, my friend.
Sounds good. Take care, buddy.
All right, bye-bye.